welcome to Completely Booked. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Gabby. We are very excited about our guest today, Dr. Michael Wiley. Dr. Wiley is a local author and literature professor at the University of North Florida. He's here today to discuss his latest novel, Monument Road, and yes, that is referring to Monument Road, the major thoroughfare in the Arlington area of Jacksonville, and the road leading up to the once bustling and beloved Regency Mall.
Professor Wiley is a thriller and mystery writer. Reviewers of his novels say that his books are dark and gritty, noir, or southern noir, and his novel Monument Road stays true to that hype. It is a robust, thrilling tale set in Northeast Florida. I've read the book and was rooting for the protagonist the whole time. Wiley does a superb job describing the ambiance of Northeast Florida, and you really get a sense of the Arlington area and its uniqueness. He writes about Regency Mall, Phillips Highway, and other well-known Jacksonville haunts.
Dr. Wiley also authors the Daniel Turner thriller series, including Blue Avenue, Second Skin, and Black Hammock, and the Shamus Award-winning Joe Kosmarski private detective series, including A Bad Night's Sleep, The Bad Kitty Lounge, and The Last Striptease. He's also written 2 books of literary criticism, Romantic Geography and Romantic Migrations.
He is a frequent book reviewer and an occasional writer of journalism, critical books, and essays. As mentioned earlier, he teaches literature at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, the setting of Monument Road, and the Daniel Turner stories. So before we give away the whole book, here is our interview with Dr. Wiley.
Thank you so much, Michael Wiley, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I grew up in the Chicago area, just north of the city, and grew up reading crime novels and crime stories. And I think the first book that I remember clearly having was The True Case Files of the FBI, when other kids were being given subscriptions to, say, Boy's Life and magazines that were age appropriate. My parents gave me Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine and Alfred Hitchcock's, anthologies of stories. And so I grew up in a family that was very much a reading family and loved that, that kind of writing. Went to high school, got in the various kinds of trouble that high school kids get in, and mostly stayed out of trouble. But, in a lot of ways, I think that I learned as much about the kinds of emotional states and the kinds of crossings of lines and transgressions in high school as we probably all do, as any place since. Worked for a while after I graduated from college, trying to make it as a freelance writer. That wasn't working particularly well, so I went out and moved to New York, got a graduate degree, and it was only a few years after that, after finishing my graduate degree, that I picked up some crime novels again and thought, boy, this is still the stuff that is my first love, and so I thought I can do this, and so I started writing it myself.
So some have described your books as noir or southern noir. What does that mean to you?
For noir lovers, my books are probably a good choice. I've always tended to be interested in, attracted to dark narratives, to stories that get into the grit, that get into, kind of the crime life of wherever one might be living or looking. North and South, it seems to me are really important divisions when we're thinking about something like crime novels. I grew up in Chicago, spent years in New York, and the kind of noir that one sees frequently there is a kind of a clipped pace and a style that's pretty ironic and, kind of reflects the coldest nights in the northern cities. Down here, I've lived here in Jacksonville now for 21 years. And there's a very different way that, we move here. There's a way that we think, and things tend to happen at a little bit more of a, if not leisurely pace, at least at a different kind of a slower pace. One of the novelists that I, turned to as I was thinking about writing in the South was James Lee Burke, who does novels with a character named Dave Robichaux, famous novels, wonderful novels. And I considered what he did, and these are big, expansive, detail-rich novels. And I thought, yeah, this is much more the kind of mode here. And so I wrote 3 novels set in Chicago before I set the next 4 here. And in many ways, they're pretty different novels. They're very different.
So your novel, Monument Road, takes place here in Northeast Florida, and it talks a lot about Jacksonville, which, I like to read dark novels. I like gritty novels, but it's kind of the opposite way to describe Florida, because Florida is always portrayed as sunshine state and everything's sunny and everything's better in Florida. So for your book, I find it so unique because nobody has written a novel like this about Jacksonville. So I just wanted to take a moment to read a paragraph or 2 for our listeners so they can understand what we're talking about.
Terrific.
Okay. So this is when the protagonist, Frankie Dast, just gets released out of prison and is trying to integrate back into society after being, incarcerated for 8 years and then finally being released by his own, I don't want to give away too much of that.
That's pretty early. Yeah, he gets himself out of jail and with some help.
Yeah. And then so he's just been released and he's getting back into life and he's back in Jacksonville and it's not the same. And so I just want to take a moment to read a paragraph or 2 about Regency Mall, which I know all of our listeners know about. Okay, so when I was a kid, the mall drew shoppers from around the city and south from the Georgia border. In the days before Christmas, traffic would back up for miles. On summer nights, you couldn't get a ticket for a new release at the AMC Cineplex unless you came 3 hours early. But now, the Regency was dying. The parking lot's almost empty. I kicked gravel as I crossed the hot pavement toward JCPenney. This time of year usually brought afternoon thunderstorms with lightning that jagged the sky and made ceilings shake even in a bolted-down prison. Now, to me, that is so Jacksonville. Monument Road is a thoroughfare through Arlington. And what made you talk about Jacksonville this way?
As you say, so much that gets written about Florida is sunny Florida. And if it's crime novels, it's especially South Florida, we get a lot of, say, the Florida Man, people like Carl Hyacin and that. And this is a different Florida, Jacksonville is. And, when we moved here, I was told, look, this is a place that has as much in common with, say, South Georgia as it does with, say, South Florida, maybe more so. We have a pretty good industrial past. We don't smell the paper mills anymore, but still with the right wind, we can get a little bit from the north coming in, and from the south, we still smell those things. We notoriously have the highest crime rate in Florida. And so Duval is a complex city, the way that, to me, Jacksonville is the way that the most interesting cities are, especially from writing fiction. For the first 10 years that we lived here, I felt entirely unready to write about this town. I was still somebody coming in from out of town and getting the first impressions and the second impressions. And those, for me at least, are a bad time to try to write about a place, because you note the obvious. You see the things that maybe the tour guides want you to see, or the Chamber of Commerce might be highlighting. But you don't get the complexities and the nuance. Especially as somebody who writes crime novels, I wanted to understand kind of the moral ambiguities, the goodness and the bad, and the bad and the good. And so it took a while. I now have 4 novels set here: Blue Avenue, Second Skin, Black Hammock, and then most recently Monument Road. And I wanted to find what struck me, at least, as being the voice of this place and the look of this place that's not in common with the rest of Florida, not in common with any other place than Jacksonville. And these are the things that I love. These are when we moved here 21 years ago, that's the Regency that I'm talking about, using Frankie Dast's childhood memory. I was in my mid-30s, but Frankie Dast was a kid when it was vibrant, and now it's not. And every city goes through those changes, but every city goes through them in its own way. Whether you have those afternoon thunderstorms in the summer, or you have, say, the blizzard in the winter in say New York or Chicago. These are the things that make me want to find my way into Jacksonville and to see its richness.
And having, presumably, I haven't, done a criminal background check on you, but presumably having never been to jail yourself or having to go through the justice system, how do you write from the perspective of a man that has been in jail for 8 years?
Right. Research, is a lot of it. And the research takes place takes the form of a lot of different things. And so I read a lot of firsthand accounts of people who were convicted, exonerated of the crimes that they were convicted of, and came out and tried to, or have tried to recreate lives for themselves. There's some amazing work of that kind. So I read a lot of those kinds of stories. I'm also a firm believer not in writing what you know so much as finding out what you need to know about in order to write about the things you want to write about. I had long wanted to write about somebody who was falsely accused of a crime, and then was investigating the crime of which, for which he was convicted. So this was something that fell into my hands nicely. As far as writing what you know goes, again, I think that by the time that most of us graduate from high school, we've known, say, what it is to be afraid in pretty deep ways. We know what it is to feel guilty of, for having done something we shouldn't have done. We know what it is to feel sad and to feel in love and to do all these other kinds of things. And so in many ways, when you take an extreme character like Frankie Dast, who has all of those things, all of these kinds of things, involved in his own life, he's working with emotions that every one of us feels. And so to make him compelling in many ways, I think, is to say, what would it be for anybody who is, say, not psychotic or a sociopath, to experience these types of experiences. And so that's what I try to write him into.
So when you said that you had always wanted to write about a character like Frankie Dast. When you're thinking of these characters, do you already have their names in mind, or do you write the book and then come up with the character's name?
Yeah, Frankie Dast is a name that I really like. And from all I can tell, there's nobody, I'm sure there's somebody in America with the last name Dast, D-A-S-T. But it's definitely not a common name, but I think it really works for him. The sound of it, the feel of it is right. In general, I unlike with a lot of things, I very much feel my way into the names, and I might revise or I might change a character's name, say 3 or 4 times between drafts before something goes, to publication. I'll tell you that probably the biggest mistake in some ways that I've made was in my first 3 novels set in Chicago. I wanted a Polish American because there's a huge Polish American population in Chicago, and I wanted him to be a private investigator. And so I called him Joe Kosmarski. And no one, I shouldn't say no one, but many people who look at the name in print cannot pronounce it. And, pretty much if anybody just says it's Joe Kos, I just nod and say, yes, that's it. And so, names count. I'm glad to have a Polish American hero. Would I have called him something maybe a little bit easier to pronounce? Probably.
Learning lesson.
That's right. Beginner mistakes,
So what is your writing process like when you're writing one of these novels? Is it like all the characters who are going to be in the book, or does it just unfold? Right. When I go to a lot of conventions and conferences, where crime writers meet, and that's a very standard question that we ask of each other, and that people who read a lot ask us as well. And the 2 extremes that we talk about are the seat of the pantsers, which are the people who, like, say, Lee Child, wonderful writer. He says that he puts the first word on the page, and then the second, and then the third, and he doesn't know where he's going. There are other people. Another friend of mine is somebody who spends over a year outlining. He knows exactly what's going to happen in each chapter, in each scene, before he actually writes the manuscript, so the outliners. I'm closer to the seat of the pantsers than to the outliners, but I try to use the best of both. For me, it's very important to know the beginning. The beginning, the hook is key. I want to have a sense of the ending as well. I need to know what I'm writing toward, because otherwise I might get to, say, page 200 or 300 and have no idea what the next word is. And so I want to know what I'm writing toward. And then I try to figure out something about the characters. And so, I'll usually have 100 or 200 or more pages of
of notes, but it's just notes, and most of those notes will find their way nowhere into the book. But I have a kind of a sense of the world that I'm writing.
Do you struggle with writing from the point of view of the opposite sex?
Probably should struggle more. No. I mean, it's like a lot of things. Like a lot of these things. One has to imagine one's way into it. Again, I don't have the experience of say a convicted murderer who's now out and building a life for himself. I don't have the experience of say an 80-year-old of either sex. I don't have the experience of a lot of people from say other ethnic or kind of social groups from my own. I think gender, of course, is one of the biggest, trickiest areas, and it's very hard. It's very hard.
Do you ever ask your wife for tips?
Oh, she's my first reader, I'd even say my best reader. She often reads my manuscripts a couple of times before, in the various stages before they go to my agent, before they go anywhere else, right? So she sees them, within crime fiction, there are conventions, so there's the femme fatale and all these kinds of things. And then, of course, there are also, the best books, are aware of those conventions, but at the same time are not beholden to them and do new things or totally throw them out and create different kinds of characters. And so I try to be aware of both, say, the necessity of capturing isn't the word I'd use, of kind of articulating characters in ways that are compelling and believable and complex, and then hope for the best.
So on that note, let's take a quick break and check in with our producer, Justin.
Hey listeners, I wanted to let you know about an upcoming author talk with Craig Pittman on his New York Times best-selling book, Oh, Florida. Author and journalist Craig Pittman tells us how Florida is both a paradise and a punchline. He recounts some of the wilder stories from Florida's history and culture, and also shows us how Florida has affected life throughout the United States. Join us on Saturday, August 31st at 1 p.m. Now, we return to the podcast.
And what kind of research do you have to do before you go into it? Because even though it is fiction, you are setting it in a very real place, being Jacksonville. So what are some things that you have to research in depth before you put them into a novel?
Did you go sit on Phillips Highway for hours?
Yeah. Every city has its Phillips Highway. In my Chicago books, I have a Phillips Highway, the equivalent of it. Here we have our Phillips Highway, that there's that one famous stretch, which again, back in the day, if you talk to people who've lived here for decades and decades, was not, in some ways it's what Regency Mall, it was the place that, in the 60s was really being built to draw people out of downtown. But now, of course, it's one of the areas that, with the adults only motels and a lot of the other things that a lot of people consider to be pretty seedy. But again, I drive through that area, pretty frequently because I live fairly near that area. And I'm always compelled by its richness, again, for the kinds of life that exists there. I go every place that I write. I try to go to every place that I write about. I read a lot of books. I try to interview people as much as I can. And then, the story has to drive everything else. And so, whatever I have with the characters and the story, then the places are going to kind of fall into place around them.
So as a professor and a writer who does obviously a ton of research, what do you do for fun? Like, do you have time to do anything else?
I have a family. I've got 3 kids, raised 3 kids, and they're all heading off to college now. They're at that age. Love to spend time with family, love to spend time traveling, love to spend time eating good food, love to spend time outside and hiking and all of these kinds of things. And so, I don't feel as if I'm lacking time for fun, but I'm also a happy workaholic. I teach full time. And so I teach a full load and, try to do that with the deepest responsibility that I can. And I write full time. There are very, very, very few days in which I don't spend at least say a half day writing, if not more. And that's just, kind of squeezing things in and around. But I don't find it unfun.
What do you have a writing process? Like, do you have to have a mug and like a pair of slippers or your favorite socks? Or can you come home from, teaching class and stay in the same clothes and write?
I started writing crime novels when we had a son, and then less than 2 years later, we had twins. And I was used at that point, I was used to writing a lot of academic scholarship, which I would need to spend, 4 or 6 hours kind of getting into the right mental state and doing all those kinds of things. Suddenly we had 3 very young kids who needed, parental attention at least, say, 55 minutes out of the 60 in an hour. And there was this, I thought, how am I going to get anything else done? And that's part of the reason I started to read crime fiction again. This is getting to your question. And then when I realized that, I wanted to write this, I tried sitting down, and I realized pretty fast that I could write with somebody bouncing on my knee, somebody else crawling up over my back, and a third kid, perched up on my head, screaming at the top of his lungs, because that was the only way it was going to happen. It was the only way it was going to happen. And so, I'm fortunate that I don't need, I don't need those creature comforts to get going. If I'm traveling, if I'm off someplace else, I might be writing on a yellow pad. Most of my writing takes place at my desk, with the computer. I still like the old desktop computer just because I like the size and the kind of the solidity of it. But beyond that, no, I write where I can and when I can, and I wake up in the middle of the night with an idea and scratch it down. And so it's just taking advantage of time.
So you mentioned that there are kind of typical conventions of fiction crime writing. Is there anything in particular that you've sort of adopted as a writer to try and subvert some of those conventions, and anything that Jacksonville has kind of handed over to you, making it a little easy?
No, that's a great question. In some sense, I am somebody who really loves the form. I really love the old Private Eye novels, the Raymond Chandler, the Robert Parker, these kinds of writers. These are ones who got me to fall in love with the form and want to do this. And so I don't ignore that. I don't ignore that. And so these writers are always in my mind when I'm writing. But we live a far distance from, say, somebody like Raymond Chandler. We live at a time when everything from the gender and the racial and the kind of generally political kind of atmosphere. All of these things are very, very, very different from what they were before. And so in some senses, this is a form that, like a lot, I think the best forms, still, somebody commits a crime, somebody is investigating, or somebody's, and eventually the crime is either resolved or not, right? That's that goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. That's what Orestes and Oedipus and people. It's Hamlet. Later on, this is a story that's a very, very long, and well-told story. And so it strikes me that we can still tell that story now. But when we tell it now, we have different kinds of considerations. We've got a different world in terms of, what we expect in terms of representations of women, in terms of people of color, people who are young and old, and all these other kinds of situations. We've got different pressing concerns. What matters to us now maybe didn't matter to people 30, 40 years ago. Again, the story in Monument Road of somebody who's been falsely accused, convicted, put on death row, and finds his way out. We heard those stories, say, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But now they're front page, right? We got Innocence Project after Innocence Project. And so this is something that we're aware of. That at kind of the national level. Locally, again, I think that each city has its own flavors and its own feels. And Jacksonville definitely does that. Not just in, say, the Regency Mall and those kinds of things, but also in the ways that we talk, the ways that we interact, the ways that various lines are drawn. Some of my characters, people have come up to me and said, I know who this is based on. And my honest answer is usually, no, you don't, because it's not, right? But in other ways, it's, it is broadly based upon, our understandings of the ways that politics works specifically in this city.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many references. It's in Jacksonville, but like the references to Sahara Sandwich Shop.
Yeah.
And you talk about the Times Union. I feel like this has just, never been done before, You hear about like crime in Florida and it's like CSI Miami, which I like, I'll watch that show. And so this is why I find this so unique, because it's happening here in Jacksonville, and our listeners just definitely need to know that this book exists.
And you were kind of, a little prescient with writing about this so long ago. The Florida man trope seems to be kind of this new wave of, he's always existed, but I think coined as Florida man.
Right.
That's a relatively new fascination.
Yeah, I think it used to be California, right?
Yeah,
California weirdness, and then Austin, or keep what, San Antonio weird, and all these rest. And there are some really good Florida man writers. Again, Carl Hyacin is probably the best of them. I mean, he really does these kind of funny, quirky people. But it's it's the dark in the dark.
Yeah.
Would you ever dabble in true crime?
I've been asked, fairly frequently, when you write about crime, people approach you with their stories. It's like, oh, I've got this story. My cousin, or I, myself, have a story to tell you. Would you be interested? No, is the short answer. Maybe in very, very kind of short form. I've written op-ed pieces and done other things based upon real crimes and real, injustices. But I really don't have a strong desire to write that, a kind of writing that I love to read. But it's just not the kind of work that I want to do.
We recently had Bob Deacle on the podcast. I don't know if you listened to that, but he's the leading prosecutor in the Ted Bundy case.
Right.
And we should link you guys up, because
Is he
I think
out at
he'd
the
be
beaches?
a good resource.
He's out at the beaches, right?
I think he's Lake City.
Lake
City. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he's written various novels too about trials he didn't prosecute himself, but has done a lot of research on, and so it's
Fantastic
interesting.
man.
Yeah, it seems like they'd be very close, but I'm sure he's at the mercy of facts, and you get to kind of be creative with it in a sense, but still research oriented at the same time.
One of the really intriguing things that happens is the lawyers, the prosecutors, who then write novels. And so Marcia Clark, O.J. Simpson, fame and all, she's a very good, very successful writer. Who Scott Turow, famously presumed innocent. It was somebody who also came over from that. Grisham, I think, maybe has a legal background as well. And so there's a lot of people who go that direction. I'm not sure how many people go the other direction, go and say, step in from, say, being interested in fiction and start writing a whole lot of, say, true crime. Though there are people who do both.
So you mentioned that you really like crime. Do you have
I don't like crime, but I like fictional crime.
You like fictional crime.
Uh-huh.
But do you have a guilty pleasure when it comes to reading? Will I ever find you reading about mermaids?
Mermaids, unlikely to find me reading about mermaids, since my kids are now no longer, 6 or 7. The thing that my wife laughs at me, because, she comes in and every Sunday, the New York Times has, in their style section, they have a whole page long story about somebody's marriage. And for some reason, I'm an addict for those. But that's about as close as I come. I read a lot of crime fiction. I read a lot of work that has to do with my academic areas as well. And then I read novels and pretty much anything else that looks really good. So if a really good book on a mermaid comes out, I'm there.
Okay. What about TV shows and movies? Do you prefer?
I watch a lot of crime shows. Yeah. And so we're Netflix people.
Us too.
Yeah, we keep our TV unplugged, except when we pull that out, which we do most nights. We pull it out, but just turn on whatever show we're binging at that time. And
did you watch Mindhunter?
Mindhunter, I did not.
What's your favorite crime show?
Oh man. I'm gonna say, I don't know about my favorite crime show, but one that I've just been watching that's been really, really interesting is Intelligence, which is just a beautifully done series that you can watch on Netflix. And it's a terrific show that is all about the ways that the intelligence kind of industry is working. This is set up in Canada, and the kind of their equivalent of the CIA is working sometimes in conjunction with and sometimes against their local mafia. They're all turning on each other, trying to find out what each other is thinking. And it's just a really well-structured, really fast-moving show.
I'm going to check it out.
Yeah, Intelligence.
Okay. You've written a lot of crime novels. What's the weirdest and strangest thing you've had to research?
I've researched everything from body decomposition times to the kinds of forensic tools that cops have to use. I've spent time riding with police both here and in Chicago. Spent time talking with homicide cops. And so I like to, I like to get into all the kind of strange and sometimes, the more kind of gruesome things that won't find their ways into my books. But the strangest, I'm going to mention the strangest experience instead. And this was early on. This is when I was still writing about Chicago, and my kids were very young. And we were going to visit some family up in northern Wisconsin, and I knew that I wanted to set a scene in a place that's along a road that's the equivalent of Phillips Highway here, and it was right at the border of Illinois and Wisconsin, and it was a strip club, and so we were going from Chicago up toward Wisconsin with our young kids in a station wagon. So we had 3 kids who were sitting in car seats. We had kind of the Chevy Chase, the equivalent of the car top carrier and all the rest. I'm wearing my cargo shorts. My wife's, sitting next to me wearing kind of her version of cargo shorts. And we're cruising along. And I said to my wife, I said, I just need to understand kind of the layout. I try to be true to the places that I write about. And so I said, do you mind if we just stop by this strip club? Which tells you something about me and tells you something maybe about my wife, that she said, oh, I guess if you need to do that, sure. And so we pulled onto that road and pulled up. It was the middle of the day, kind of early afternoon. We pulled up, and there were two big beefy guys wearing kind of muscle t-shirts, and we pull up in this station wagon with 3 kids in the back, probably screaming at that point. And I climb out. And the look on these guys, and these guys could take care of any situation that faced them. They see this, thin, skinny guy coming across the parking lot wearing cargo shorts, heading for the door, while the station wagon's behind, and they came charging down. They were up, kind of on a raised stairway a little bit. They came charging down to the parking lot and said, "No, get out of here. Out of here." They were not going to let me near the place. To this day, I have no idea what they thought I was there to do. Maybe it was to convert the dancers. Maybe it was to, make a point with my family. I have no idea what it was. But that was the strangest one. And so I never did see that place. And so that's the strangest research that never happened. I never did go in.
That'd make a great short story. The strangest research that never happened.
The strangest research, yeah.
I think people have a huge fascination. I mean, you guys alone with, crime and fiction or nonfiction. I think there's just like a huge wave of people that are just captivated by crime, whether it's Netflix churning out shows by the week, it seems. But they're not necessarily people that like to think about their own demise, which I always find interesting. They get really wrapped into these gruesome murder stories. But why do you think that is? Why do you think people are so interested in other people's gruesome
I think
deaths?
that totally explains it. I think that in a way you just explained, I don't want to think about my death. I don't want to think about all of these kinds of things in terms of family members and all the rest. And so when you get fiction, right, it wraps it up. And so even the stories that don't find the culprit, even the ones that go on for 6 seasons without wrapping up that story that you kind of feel like should have been wrapped up early on, still each time there's a kind of a way of containing those fears. I was having a conversation the other day with a book group, and we were talking about what's permissible and what's not permissible, and these are people who are used to reading some pretty gruesome, gritty crime novels, lots of death, and I asked for a show of hands. I said, how many of us will put down a book that involves the killing of a dog? And it was universal. It was universal. I said, how many people would put it down if it involves the killing of a cat? Again, everybody's hands went up. What I didn't ask, though we kind of discussed our way around it, was, how many of us, and you don't want to, you couldn't, you'd never want to be in a situation in which you'd have to make this decision. But, how many of us, when it really comes down to it, would say, all right, if, say, 30 people, that's a high body count. Let's say if 3 people could be, we're going to die, or a dog is going to die, which would you make a decision? And probably, if it came down to it, probably most people would choose the dog, right, in real life. But because this is fiction, we don't mind seeing the dead bodies, right? As long as they're human, because they can be complex thinkers. But the idea of a dog, the innocence, or the cat, or a child, right? A lot of us won't read books. I don't kill kids. I just won't.
And do you kill?
Well, in Monument Road, there's, before it starts, there are two children who are dead, but never will we see them killed in the book. It's just something I partly maybe having kids of my own, I just don't have a taste for. But yeah, I cross a lot of lines, but not that one. And so it's an interesting.
Wait, have you written about a dog or cat dying?
I wish I could say no.
I haven't read all your novels. So.
Yeah, I wish I could say no, because I think of myself as never killing a pet, because it's one of those lines that, again, it feels cheap. But in two of my books, an animal does die. One of them is a vicious attack dog that's in the process. It's been trained to kill, and that one gets shot. I have yet to hear anybody complain about that dog. You couldn't kill it. And the reality is the dog has basically been trained to do what it's doing. Is it really mean, or has it been made this way? Well, the reality is that it's kind of either the dog or the victim. And then the other one, a cat does get it. And I still don't forgive myself for that one.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Like, anytime I'm watching a movie, I'm like, this dog better not die.
Right. Have you seen the John Wick movies?
No.
Yeah. It's, again, that I'm embarrassed. I'm not embarrassed to say that I've seen them, but we did a kind of a Wickathon this summer, because John Wick, the third movie, just came out. Yeah. And the whole premise is John Wick, he's been an assassin. This is not giving any, this is not a spoiler at all. But basically his wife has died, and he has a dog that also gets killed. And it's the dog, kind of the one thing that's connected to his love of his wife. It's the dog's killing that sets him off on, so far 3 movies, with a 4th one clearly coming.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm always like, I'm just going to Google to see if the dog dies, just so I don't care about the people.
Right. No, I know. It's a really weird thing.
It's a really weird thing.
Yeah. I won't go into it too far, but I think but it makes to me 100% sense, because we're used to seeing people die in movies, in books. You don't want the good character to die, but from the time that we were very, very small, we were reading stories in which, there were people in danger, and, the stepmother is in there only because the real mother died. Little kids are used to this, but don't kill a unicorn. Don't kill a puppy. Right.
Right.
I feel like horror films have sort of recently been crossing this line into somewhat crime, somewhat psychological thriller, which I feel like can kind of overlap with your genre a little bit. How do you feel about this sort of merging of the genres that used to have their really strict tropes, and now they're kind of blending in and trying to recreate a super genre almost?
Right. One, I don't know that they've always had, strict lines. I think back, a couple hundred years ago, in the way people were mixing up crime and, say, gothic romance and things like that. And so that I think has gone on. But to me, the more the merrier, right? To me, the more the richer. Genre lines, I love a lot that I would say is typical of the crime fiction genre. And one of the things I love about it is how versatile it is. I was already saying before that, a lot of things that we consider to be kind of capital L literature, are using, or inventing, most of what we consider to be conventional to crime fiction. You can go back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with that. Anytime that you can do something that you do well, I say go for it.
Do you have any other drafts in the works for another novel in the series, or do you know how many you want to end up with?
I actually have 3 contracted books right now that are coming out. The first of them is coming out in January 2020, so it's right around the corner. That's set back in Chicago, and there will be 3 books in that series so far, though I might have more. Beyond that, I'm right now working on something that is mostly set in Jacksonville. This is not another Frankie Dast book. It's a book that is starting off in around the year 1950 and reaching up through the 1980s. Every time I write something new, I try to do something that I haven't done before. And so that's what I'm doing this time.
That's impressive.
As a writer, what would you choose as this is kind of a funny question because you write such dark stuff. I want to know what you would choose as your mascot or avatar or spirit animal.
A dead cat. No, I'm kidding. I would not have a dead cat. I would probably do something that flies, and I'm not sure what it would be that flies, but a bird of prey, probably just because of, I don't know, because of the feel. It's kind of like me naming Joe Kosmarski. It's not, there's not a rational reason for it other than kind of the precision, the movement. I like everything from the strength of that kind of a bird to the distance that a lot of them can fly. I don't think I'm ready to go for an albatross. That seems a little too pessimistic. But something that can fly long distances, that can fly straight and true, as well as kind of turn on, turn in the air on a pin kind of thing.
Yeah, I can totally see that. But you wouldn't like attack a dog or a cat, right?
No, not my bird of prey.
So as we mentioned before, you are a professor at UNF, but when you go to pick out material for your courses, what sort of periods of literature do you typically pull from, or is it kind of a mix? Like, how do you go about putting together a book list for your courses?
Sure. I teach, I guess I could broadly say that I teach three different areas. One is in the area that I was hired to teach, which is the British Romantics, late 18th, early 19th century British literature. And so, if Wordsworth is dancing through the daffodils and pulls out a Glock, you know that I've begun to mix things up. But it's Wordsworth and William Blake and Charlotte Smith and Mary Shelley, some of those major writers from the British period. That's what I was hired to teach, and that's what I did my graduate work years ago in. So that's one of the areas I teach a lot. Another area that I teach a lot, especially in recent years, has been in crime fiction and crime writing and just kind of writing in general. And so, that can either be a literature course, and then we're going to be looking at, especially for, say, my crime novels or crime fiction reading classes, we're going to be reading usually a fairly dark list. A lot of the people ranging from, say, Raymond Chandler up to, say, James Lee Burke, and kind of that would probably be a pretty good spectrum. The third area is probably more theoretically based, and so I teach a course that's all about authorship and deals with what we consider to be authorized authorship versus, say, fraudulent authorship, the different kinds of things that people have done, all the way from the ancient Greeks to the present, and then also courses that deal fairly heavily with theoretical approaches to literature and understanding what writing might be.
From your point of view of on yourself, are you a successful writer, or what does literary success look like to you?
You asked some good, tough questions. To me, literary success means writing the book that I think I'm most capable of writing and accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish in each book. And I like to think that at least when I finish each one, I've done as well as I can on that. Would I like to be one of those people who sells 1 million copies this year and 1 million copies next year? I have yet to meet anybody who would not like to be that kind of writer. My books are what we sometimes call mid-list, and so they do well, but they could do better in terms of the sales. And so what they do well, I think, and I hope, is they tell stories in ways that are true to the best of my ability to perceive the ways that people act and interact. That give as much entertainment as possible for doing all of that. I don't know. I don't think that I'll ever call myself, no matter where I would get, I don't know that I would call myself successful, because I think that success is what or at least I'm always reaching toward. But at the same time, I guess I'm successful in thinking that I couldn't do better than I have done. However however good that might or might not be.
That's a fair assessment of yourself.
That was more in depth.
I mean, sometimes it takes people years and years and years for one novel and the publishing process alone.
And a full-time professor and a dad of 3 and a husband.
Right.
Success
I'm
to
impressed.
you. That sounds pretty successful.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that I'm a better person to live with if I'm busy. And so I do it. I do it because I love to do it.
I'm thinking back to a little anecdote that Bob Deacle had about his sense of humor maybe being a little off compared to people around him. Him and his wife were at a dinner party, and he's telling the story that he finds hilarious about, some graphic murder. And he looks around the room and notices everybody's faces are just kind of
paling. Right?
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself in that situation?
Not that kind of situation. I do like dark humor. I very much like dark humor. And I'm fortunate to live in a family, my immediate family, we all like dark humor. And so that's that partly avoids those problems. And I guess I've got enough of a personal sense that even if I do find something, I do find myself self-censoring at which we all do, right? We all do. But I'll say this is that, of the groups of people that I have met, through my life, I spend a lot of time, overall with crime writers at conventions and places. And they're the funniest group of people I've ever met. I mean, they just are. It tends to be a group of people who share something of a sensibility, and frequently they'll tell a good story.
I wonder what people that author books on romance or something like that would think of your group of friends, and what you think is funny to them. They might be like,
Well, there's crossover. As you were saying, especially with, say, horror and crime. But people who do genre fiction, sometimes have a foot in various kinds of areas. And so one of the people who, is well known for this is Charlene Harris, who did the books upon which True Blood. Do you remember True Blood?
The vampire?
On HBO.
And so she spends time at the crime fiction conventions, and she spends time with romance as well. And so, it's, I don't know what they would say. I don't know whether they'd say this is a really funny group, but some of those people who are in one group also are in those other groups. So I have no idea. So I hope that they keep on telling jokes among the romance writers. I don't know.
If you weren't teaching and you weren't writing, what do you think you'd be doing?
In those alternatives, in all those alternative worlds, I could come up with many different scenarios. One of the things that I would love to do, and I spend pretty much zero time doing, is, living a life on the water. And so, in the darkest moments, I think, I could just quit everything and work on a shrimp boat. I know that would probably run out, the appeal would run out real fast. Love the mountains. I could see living in many cities around the world, New York or London or Beijing or, some of these places, again, with my love of travel, I've spent some time there, but I could imagine creating a life in many different places.
Since we are a library and we love books, let's talk about some books.
Love to.
You've already mentioned a lot of authors, but do you have any memories? What's your first memory of a book that has touched you so deeply you cried?
Ooh, it touched me so deeply that I cried. The one that I remember, the first crying experience of reading a book was of Mice and Men. Yeah. And, I was a sucker for Lenny, poor Lenny. He was Steinbeck. It's not a book that I have read in many, many years, but I do remember being moved by that. I don't tend to cry a lot when I read, but that was one that did it to me when I was in high school.
Do you think that novel made you realize the power of words and perhaps inspired you to become a writer?
No. What it pointed out to me, definitely power of words, yes. Power of words. But in terms of inspiring me to become a writer, I think it pointed out something to me that is one of the areas that I continue to try to get better. You're talking about success as a writer. And one of the areas that I know that I stand room for improvement is being able to make my characters so compelling that readers would cry, if something bad happened to them, or to invest ourselves enough in characters. I think very, very few books are able to do that for most readers. I think some can, some can, but I'd love to be able to write more emotionally powerful characters. And so, I guess it set a very high bar as much as anything. But there were a lot of different, so many writers who made me want to be a writer.
Yeah. Well, I feel like, Frankie Dast, I grew to really appreciate him. And when he started getting, I don't know, I feel like he's, he had flaws in the beginning, but then he started standing up for himself. And I was like, yeah, go Frankie.
Frankie is a character I really, really have worked hard to make lovable. And he does some very unlovable things, and he does some really dumb things like the rest of us, but usually with not as high stakes as he has. And so thank you, thank you. That
I was
that means
rooting
a lot
for
to me.
him.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm good. Yeah. I root for him. The funny thing is I root for all of my characters. I've got a low bar for love. It's a.
What is your least favorite genre to read and why?
I hadn't thought about that. Boy. I'm not a big fan of romance. Even though I think that, I greatly admire people who do it well. And why? I don't know. It's almost like saying, why don't you like the taste of certain foods, right? Why don't you like certain genres of music? I guess I don't find it compelling. I don't find it interesting. I don't find the characterization, just because of my taste and because of my interests. I don't find it always, telling me something that I want to know about the world or about people. And so I might stick there. I'm a pretty, I'm a pretty gluttonous reader. I'll read just about anything, including, well done romance.
When you read, do you prefer a book, like a hardcover book?
Yes.
Or an e-reader?
Yeah, I feel like I'm a dinosaur. In my own family, I'm the only one who reads paper at this point, and I love to feel paper. And I'll read the newspaper, I'll read magazine articles, I'll read other things electronically, but I'm a great lover of the page.
And is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know about Michael Wiley that maybe nobody knows?
Oh no, I'll say this. I'll say that I'm a great lover of libraries, and one of the things that some writers say, oh, well, buy my book and then go to the library. But I always say, go to the library and go to the library. Read all of our books.
Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Oh, thank you for
it was an
inviting
absolute
me.
Pleasure.
Love talking to you.
We hope you guys enjoyed our discussion with Dr. Michael Wiley. You can find out more info about Michael on the Jacksonville Public Library blog, and you can also use your library card to check out all of his books here at the library or on Hoopla.
If you loved our podcast today, be sure to rate and review us. We always love to hear your feedback.
Until next week, I'm Amanda.
And I'm Gabby. Bye, guys.